Good morning, or depending on when you're watching this, good afternoon, good evening, or good night. My name's Ross, and as always told, out of Voice of Radio. So today we need to take a look at, well, these Marnie and Steven decks over in Japan, because they're out. And I showed you just yesterday that we are getting our own versions of the Marnie and Steven decks, and they're actually incredibly cool. Because the Marnie and Steven decks that we're getting are... they're not exactly the same as Japan, but they're pretty gosh darn close. And they include all of the cards, and the illustration rares are exclusive, but the other cards are not exclusive, but it's still cool that we're getting them. But over in Japan, things are different. Over in Japan, the Marnie cards are only found in the Marnie deck. And the Steven cards are only found in the Steven deck, and that means that if you want to play these decks... it's not just about the fancy illustration rares, although we will obviously get to them. If you want to play these decks, you've got to have these decks. Now, I'm very much of the opinion that I don't think the Marnie deck is very good. Sorry if that sounds a little bit mean, but as I've explained it to you before, essentially we've got Marnie's Grimmsnarl EX, which accelerates 5 darkness energy to your Marnie's Pokemon when you evolve into it. And we've got ourselves a stadium that once during your turn lets you search for a Marnie card. Or Marnie Pokemon. And this all seems really, really good. And this all sounds fantastic. Except I am very much of the opinion that we don't have anything with which to attack. We got Grimmsnarl that does 180 active and 30 to one of your opponent's bench Pokemon, which I don't think is good enough. Morpeko that does 20 damage base, plus 40 for each darkness energy attached to it, which with 5 energy from a Grimmsnarl is 220, but 220 isn't enough, and then you got 70 HP, you're just going to get return KO'd anyway. So I don't think that's particularly good. We've got ourselves Lipard that does 70 damage, plus an extra 70 against an EX, which again I just don't think is good enough. And then we've got ourselves a Scrafty, which does 160 and then 30 to itself. Like, there's nothing here that's good to attack with. That's my big issue with the Marnie deck. Now, this is all very relevant as a preamble, because if we look at the singles prices for the Marnie cards, they're all pretty cheap. They're generally pretty gosh darn cheap. Like, the most expensive playable cards are Grimmsnarl and Morpeko, both of which come in at 380 yen. That's kind of not bad, honestly. That'll do quite nicely. If anybody's wondering, Scrafty is 80 yen and Lipard is 50 yen, which is basically nothing. So, yeah, we've got the Grimmsnarl here, and we got the Morpeko coming in at about 380 yen each, which is honestly not too bad. 380 yen, you're talking somewhere in the region of like $2.50. Now, that's kind of interesting, of course, because if you wanted to get, you know, all your Grimmsnarl and all your Morpeko, that is going to start adding up, but it's still going to end up as a pretty cheap deck, let's be clear. It's still not going to be breaking the bank, but it's very interesting to me that those cards are, you know, compared to like the Steven deck, for instance, comparatively a little bit cheaper. Also, I probably should just point out nice and quickly that in terms of the Marnie and Steven decks, they're retailing over in Japan for 1,800 yen. Now that's very, very relevant, because it means if you were to buy like 2 Grimmsnarl and 2 Morpeko, for instance, you're paying 380 yen times 4, that's already 1,520. And they retail for 1,800. So, comparatively speaking, these singles are quite expensive given the price of the decks, but obviously the deck sold out like instantly, so that explains it. Over with Steven is a lot more playable, but it's really just the Metagross. The Stage 2 Metagross has got an ability whereby, once during your turn, it's not on Evolve, it's any time, you can attach a Metal and a Psychic Energy from your deck, so you don't have to have them in your hand or in your discard, to your Psychic or Metal Pokemon. So it's not just for Steven's decks, it happens to be a Steven's card, but it's not for Steven's decks, it works for anyone. And that's kind of the point here. This is actually really good. And over in Japan right now, This is actually really good. This Steven's Metagross is seeing significant play. I'm not arguing it's the best deck in the format or anything like that, but I am arguing that it is seeing significant play. It is out there, it is seeing play, it is being used, it is pretty good. I'm seeing a bunch of decks popping up. But whereas like your main attacker, if you were playing Steven, your main attacker here would be Claydol. Claydol for free energy does 220 and discards all energy from it, but in theory you can just use Metagross to build it back up again nice and quickly, so it's not really going to matter. That's kind of the point here. Well, yeah, the Claydol is like an 80 yen card, it's nothing, but the Metagross is 600 yen right now. The Metagross you're paying 600 yen. That is 1/3 of the price of the deck all by itself. And you got 2 copies when you bought the deck. So the 2 Metagross alone, right now on the secondary market, you're talking 1,200 yen. The deck as a whole cost 1,800. These Metagross are pretty sought after. But again, unlike in the West, if you're in Japan, if you want this Metagross, you've got to buy the Stevens deck. We know that our Stevens deck is going to have 2 copies of Metagross in. We also know that Metagross is going to be in the next set. The one after Journey Together, Destined Rivals. We know it's going to be in that set. So there's no issue there at all. But in Japan, you have to buy the Metagross deck in order to actually get Metagross. That's why Metagross alone is 1/3 of the price of the deck when you get 2 in there. It is worth noting the Carbink also comes in at 380 yen. That's the one that reduces damage by 30 to your Stevens Pokemon. And actually, the reprint of Energy Recycler, old card but it's coming back in this deck, is also 380 yen. So the singles for this, they're pretty cheap in a vacuum. But compared to the price of the deck, they're really rather expensive. But of course, the selling price of the deck was the illustration rares. And this is where things get interesting. Because the illustration rare Beldon right now is 2,200 yen. Now, there's 2 ways to look at this. On the one hand, 2,200 yen, you're talking somewhere in the region of 1,450. It's not that expensive. It's on the higher end of illustration rares generally, but it's not that expensive. Another way to look at it is the deck was 1,800 yen. This single is 2,200 yen. So if you missed out on buying the deck, you've now got to pay more than the deck just to get this illustration rare on its own. I, for one, am very happy that I did manage to pick up the deck. But of course, I told you all alone that the Beldon was not the big illustration rare from these decks. Marnie's Morpeko was a big illustration rare. Now, currently this is about 3,300 yen, but it's just selling out constantly. Like the websites I'm checking, it's coming in and out of stock, but most of the time it's out of stock, which means the price is creeping upwards. 3,300 yen, you're talking almost exactly $22, but that's also not far off double the price of the deck. The deck was 1,800, double would be 3,600, this is 3,300. And this is why I've got a lot of sympathy for the people that missed out on getting the deck, because the way it worked is the way it often works in Japan right now, where they go up for pre-order, and there's a waiting room, and it's just kind of a, can you get into the waiting room before they all sell out, or through the waiting room into the actual store itself? And I was lucky and did, and a bunch of people didn't. So if you were in the queue, you were trying to buy the deck, you missed out on the deck, you've now got to pay almost double the price of the deck just for Marnie's Morpeko. And over in the West, our Marnie's and Steven decks are going to have the illustration rares, and they are going to be exclusive. They are promos, the only way to get them is by buying the deck. But over in Japan, all of the mechanically unique cards are also exclusive. Energy Recycler is a very playable card, and I would imagine that will end up in a set. But right now it's exclusive to these decks, and that works in a bunch of stuff, not just Marnie and Steven decks. The Grim Snarly X I don't think is great, but you never know, maybe one day it will be. It's exclusive. You absolutely can't imagine the Metagross being great in the future. I mean, it's pretty good right now. It could legitimately be great in the future, and that's exclusive. And that's why these singles are kind of jumping up the way they are. If all you wanted to get, if the only things you were interested in were picking up, a couple copies of Metagross and the Beldum, if that was all you were thinking of picking up, well, right now, you're paying 3,400 yen for that. Just for 2 Metagross and a Beldum. And the deck retailed for 1,800 yen. If you want to buy yourself 2 Marnie's Grimmsnarl and a Morpeko, right now that's setting you back 4,100 yen. That is more than double the price of the deck. And this is one of the reasons I am desperately hoping there's a reprint of these decks. Not because I need it, but because a lot of people do. It is the downside of having mechanically unique cards and artistically unique cards in these decks. It means if you don't have enough of them, you do end up in a little bit of an issue, because when they sell out, and for really sought after ones like this, they do tend to sell out, you end up with a lot of disappointed people. Now, this is the point where a bunch of you start going, why didn't Pokemon make more? Why couldn't they have seen this coming? How could they have messed up so badly? And the usual stuff we hear from people when this stuff's coming on. And the answer is, because this doesn't normally happen. Like the Saru Legend Sylveon decks, they were moderately popular. Those decks did not sell out that quickly. There was nothing like, they had the exclusive EXs in. It was nothing like this. Now, this has the illustration rares, which does, I think, help to explain it a little bit. But the answer essentially is, this doesn't normally happen. These are the first decks we've seen in a long time where the decks have actually been super exclusive and hard to get hold of, and that's essentially your explanation. These decks generally don't sell out very fast, which is why Pokemon didn't prepare to them sell out very fast. It is as simple as that. But I've told you what you need to know, so now it's over to you guys. Tell me what you think about these decks. Did you pick them up in Japan? Are you picking them up over here? Go nuts in the comment section, but be nice! And then make sure you like this video, subscribe to this channel, follow me on Twitter at TheWasi. That's where we talk about Pokemon and a whole bunch of other card games. And please do consider checking out patreon.com/PTCG Radio, where you can support the channel, get some bonus podcasts and all kinds of fun things. But by far the most important thing, as always, look after yourselves till next time, would ya? Thank you very much for watching. My name's Ross, and you've been watching PTCG Radio.